Hi everybody, I'm Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital, and today I'm going to talk about a data entry field directive example. This is some example code that we use when we teach the Angular boot camp. Sometimes, each class is a little bit different depending on the needs of the students. This is a Angular 1.4 or 1.x example, even though as I record this in the fall of 2015, much of our work has shifted to Angular 2, which will be entering beta shortly. But still, this is what we use in the Angular 1 edition of the Angular Bootcamp, and I'm going to show how it works and then explain the code behind it. Okay, so this is a data entry application. Let me get back to the beginning here. It's a data entry application. This simulates like a job application form, and it's not meant to be a working real application. We know that a real application would have a lot more features, but it's just meant to show some things about how you program Angular forms. Okay, so I can go in here, maybe type in just a name or something, whatever, John, whatever, Smith, put in a middle initial, however. But you see that this is a relatively complete Angular form example. If I type something too long, I get a too long validation problem there. If I leave out certain fields, I get a required field marker. So you can guess I'm using ng messages for these bits down here. I have some placeholders and masks in place. I have a drop-down date picker, and this is just the Angular UI Bootstrap date picker, so nothing custom or interesting here. We have a drop-down, and when you pick an entry over in the data, we bind a code behind the entry. So again, it's somewhat typical of what you would see. You can go to another set of fields and enter more, yet another set of fields, do even more. But whatever you do here, it just gets data bound into here, and then of course it has, as I said, lots of features. Okay, let me get back to the screen here. So how does this thing work? Okay, that's the interesting part. And this is why we use it in class, because we get to explain interesting things about how Angular programming can work. So this is an example of hopefully a good way to use directives to reduce the verbosity of your markup. Here's the top level file. The only thing that's not purely demo in here is just the ng view, because we're using the router to substitute in each set of fields. So we have just the ordinary stuff. We load Angular, the router, Angular messages, and then these specific bits that we're using for some of the controls in this demo. And then I'm loading all the files that comprise the demo library and then the demo application. Of course, in a real system, there'd be build processes, there might be a module system, all sorts of things. But for this example code we use in class, we try to keep it simple and inline. Okay, each page of fields looks something like this. And I'm just showing this one, the others are basically identical. The important thing here is that the template for this page of fields is really all about the layout of the field. So I have these divs with bootstrap classes, and then I have this thing I call a dyna field, and that's really the interesting thing that's going on here, and it puts in the label and the control. Because I've abstracted that idea into a directive this way, the markup for a page remains very simple. I could have, easily a page with 50 of these on here, and the markup would still be reasonably manageable. Anyone who's programmed Angular forms sort of in a more manual fashion knows that to get all of this stuff right, to get the requiredness and the masks, to get the drop-downs, to get all the little bits right, you end up with quite a bit of markup for each control. And so that has all been abstracted behind this thing called a dyna field. Now I'm going to show how this dyna field works, and again, this is just something that I made up to use in teaching and transferring knowledge. We've implemented things like this in numerous projects, and they're all much more complex than what I'm going to show in this example. So this is the overall dyna field directive. It is almost exactly follows the component directive pattern. It has an isolated scope. You pass in the information it needs. It's restricted to use as an element. So this sort of matches that new component idea that's actually being burned into Angular 1.5 and is already reified in Angular 2. A few interesting directive features are used here that you don't see every day. For example, there's a function that returns the template instead of a reference, instead of an inline template or a URL of a template, we have a function that returns the template. And then I'm using the require feature to get a reference to the form where this field is used. And that comes in handy for the Oh, for the ng message stuff, you need to use the form to find the Angular field object to do the right things. Next, this load function. This is not really very Angular. This is just the way by which the software can dig out the entity and field name from the markup, and it can alternately be specified here. Like I can actually type out entity right there, and then that is implemented up in this line right here. So that's what the load function does. It just digs up the metadata for this specific bit. Next, we want to load the template for that bit. Well, loading a template means we call this, we further delegate to this template function, and we tell it what the key information is to put inside. And the idea here is, if I just study the metadata, let's say I'm trying to put the control up there for qualification.skill. Well, I would look up qualification, look up skill, and inside that would be a marker of widget, or a field of widget. And then at the point of use, we will use dynafield-text, because that's the kind of widget it was. That means that the essence of this thing will be delegated to a dynafield text directive, which we'll see in a moment. So all that's really left here is the template for the overall dynafield directive. In the past, we've followed and given the advice many times to not write your templates in line. It's just messy to mix JavaScript with HTML. But in the last couple of years, there's been a movement the other direction. I think maybe the movement was started by the React people with they have that special JSX syntax. I've used that a little bit and been pretty happy with it. So for Angular 2 examples, we're seeing almost universal use in Angular 2 examples of inline templates. Even though I still don't recommend that for any kind of use at scale, because it's so popular, I've decided to simply follow the crowd and write most of my template right in the JavaScript file here. The only thing unusual here is that I have this marker here, and then I use a string replace to stick in the specific kind of dynafield that we're using in the middle of this overall template. Now, the nice thing about this overall template is there's so many things that you want to get right and consistent between every entry field. So things like the bootstrap classes, having a label, binding it correctly based on the ID, assigning an ng message for all the different ways that things can go wrong. So these are all things that in the traditional kind of hand-coded form development, you would end up repeating this and end up with hundreds and hundreds of lines of markup for even a form that's not even that complex. Okay, so one more bit worth looking at. Well, I had pointed to the text one earlier, but that's maybe a little bit too simple. Let's look at the select. If the widget type was select, then that will become something like dynafield-select when it's inserted into the template, which Angular will then translate into the JavaScript naming convention to find this directive. So that's how we'll end up at this directive. And this is yet another straightforward directive, and this time I don't even have any code in a link function. I just put these link functions in to illustrate in class that in a real application you'll almost always have some more specific code for specific types of fields. But still, that's what's basically going on here, is we have a specific directive for this subtype, and it has its own template, and its template does all in exactly the things that need to be done to make a select work well. So just to review the abstraction from the beginning, out here I just said I want I want the entry field for applicant.country. The system looked up in the metadata to find out that applicant.country should be a select field with these options. At the point of use, I only had to invoke the generic dyna field. In other words, I did not need to repeat myself. So I've already said over here that country is a select, so I have not had to say again here that country is a select. I just said dyna field. Then in the dyna field, we delegated down to the select directive, which we then used the template for a select, and the net result is, as we saw on the screen in the first place, that country does the right thing, even though at the point of use, the amount of markup is trivial and abstract and really pretty idealized. Okay, so that's really all I have to explain here. Again, this is just one of a number of examples that we use when teaching the Angular Bootcamp. Different classes use different examples, so if you've been to Angular Bootcamp and you didn't see this one, that's okay. We probably showed you something different instead. If you're interested, it's angularbootcamp.com. If you're interested in seeing this code, we've thought about publishing more of our examples that we use in class, just because we think they have some value to the internet as a whole. They try to have some comments so that it's not purely useful only in class. But for the moment anyway, if you do want to see these examples, the answer is to sign up for Angular Bootcamp. So come take a look at our website. Thanks.